October, St. Louis has had, I guess, since they've started recording the information. And I don't know, maybe we'll get a break from the rain, but I'm glad that you came out for our first conservation conversation program. My name is Jim Jordan. I'm the Curator of Education with the St. Louis Zoo. And this year, we are partnering this series with the Academy of Science, and I'd like to introduce Rose Jansen, who's going to mention a few things about other opportunities with the Academy, and then we'll get back to the series.
Good evening. My name is Rose, and I'm with the Academy of Science. And for those of you who are not familiar with us, I'm going to take just a couple minutes to tell you a little bit about who we are. We're one of the nation's oldest science academies. I think we are the oldest science academy west of the Alleghenies. We've been around since 1856. We have, it's our mission to promote the public understanding of science, and we do that through a number of outreach initiatives, one of which is this particular program, and we're very pleased to be partnering with the St. Louis Zoo. We do another science seminar series with the zoo that some of you may be familiar with. We also partner with a number of other institutions and organizations in the area on public science seminar programs. They're all free and open to the public. You can find more information on those either on our website at www.academyofscience.stl.org, or there is information outside on the visitors desk, so you can feel free to pick up any of that and take any of that along with you when you leave this evening. And then we'll have some e-news sign-up sheets that will go around. We'll pass those around the audience. You can jot your name and address and or email address on those, and you'll get notification from both the Academy and the Zoo of upcoming opportunities, and we won't share your name with other organizations. If you're familiar with who we are and this whole process, you don't need to sign your name a second time. And then I'd like to mention just very quickly a couple up-and-coming events that you might have an interest in. We have, in December, we have we partner with the Missouri History Museum. It's a series called Perspectives on Science and History. We have an Egyptologist from Missouri who will be out speaking on December the 15th. That's a Tuesday evening. Treasures from the Ancient World, Tales of an Early American Egyptologist, and there's actually a Missouri connection, but I won't tell you what that is. You'll have to attend to find out. We have a new series that we're doing as well with the Kirkwood School District, and the first in that series is on November the 14th. That's a Thursday, no, I'm sorry, November the 19th. That's a Thursday evening from 7 to 8:30. It's in the Kirkwood High School auditorium. Brain control, thoughts made motion. It's about brain-computer interface technology. And again, there's more information on that series and some of those upcoming lectures and talks outside on the visitors desk this evening. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim.
So I'm going to mention a couple other opportunities that we have coming up here at the zoo. This, again, is our first for the conservation conversations on November 17th, which is another Tuesday, the return of the peregrine falcon. Jackie Fallon is the Midwest Peregrine Society coordinator, and she's been working in a number of states in the upper Midwest on peregrines. She's also going to be able to bring in her peregrines so that people can get an up-close look at this magnificent bird, as well as talk about how it's been brought back almost from extinction, and that there are a number of nesting pairs here in the St. Louis area. Next week on Wednesday with our science seminar, The Most Violent Places in the Universe, in which Dr. James Buckley, who's the St. Louis Scientist Innovation Award recipient from the Academy, will be here talking about astronomy and some of the ways that we're able to probe really deep into the universe and find out some of these strange events and phenomenon. So for tonight's program, Drying Up, Extinction in the Sahara, Bill Houston is the General Curator of, or Assistant General Curator of the Animal Division, and Bill has been here at the zoo for 27 years. His background is in animal science from Cornell, University in New York. I also grew up in New York, but I didn't go to Cornell. He has worked with the hoofstock and elephant areas here in Animal Division for many years. Bill has been a leader at our zoo in helping to examine and implement or get staff enrolled in implementing best practices for providing highest quality of care for our animals. And he, along with Martha Fisher, was very instrumental in moving towards protective contact with our elephant herd. And we've been, kind of leading the way in many ways on how to manage elephants. Bill, if you may know, has a fondness of pigs and peccaries. So as you go through our collection, especially up at the hoofstock area, you'll notice that we do have a number of members there. And I do believe that Bill voted that the kudu should be replaced with a Red River hog as far as our zoo symbol. But that is a magnificent animal. Bill has been the coordinator of the addax SSP Species Survival Plan since 1996, and that's where his interest in the Sahara has kind of evolved from. And he has been working with conservation in the Sahara since 2002 with John Newby, who's now the CEO of the Sahara Conservation Fund. And his work there has bloomed into the Sahara Conservation Center. That's part of our Wild Care Center, and it's just really heartening to see how many species that they've been working with, and Bill will talk about those from carnivores to ostrich, as well as many of the hoofstock. So with that, I'd like to have Bill come up to the stage and provide information on how the zoo's impacting conservation in the Sahara.
Thank you, Jim. There's something definitely ironic about everybody coming out on one of the coldest, wettest nights of the year to hear about one of the hottest, driest places on the planet. Let me get this thing out of our way. Oh, that's not a nice picture. Oops, we went a little too far there. With apologies to Jim for a last-minute change because I thought the title sounded just a little too dismal. I thought we would have a chance to talk today about life on the edge, conserving the Sahara's threatened wildlife. And the Sahara is an incredible place with surprising amount of diversity of wildlife in it. But it's an area that is largely overlooked and underfunded when it comes to both aid agencies for human development as well as for conservation as well. Come on now, you want to go. Oh, get off that button, Bill. You'd think I'd never used PowerPoint before. The Sahara is located in North Africa, northern and western Africa. It's the biggest desert on the planet. It's 3 million square miles. That's roughly the size of the United States or Australia, or about a quarter of the continent of Africa. It has rainfall is incredibly slight there, less than 5 inches a year. There are some places in the Sahara where it might rain once and then not rain again for 4 to 7 years. We could use some of that right now, right? It's shared by 14 nations, so any strategy to try to conserve wildlife in the Sahara depends on trying to sort through all of the different political and cultural and other differences that occur between all those 14 nations. There is a uniquely adapted biodiversity found in this region. Many of them are threatened species, and again, it's an area that's largely ignored by the conservation community until quite recently. I usually, when I do this talk, I like to ask people if they could tell me what the largest mammal, terrestrial mammal, to go extinct in the last 30 years is. Does anybody here know? If you're like most people, you immediately start thinking about the tropical rainforests or maybe some exotic creature that lives in maybe in the, well, not terrestrial on coral reefs or anything like that, but in the tropical rainforest. And that's because we do such a really good job of pumping up the need for conservation in these biodiversity zones like the tropics. And it's very important to do so because the money that you spend on conservation in places like the tropics is money well spent, and that it has an opportunity to conserve the largest number of species. But by the same token, large areas of land that are desertified like the Sahara fall right off of everybody's radar screens because of this triage method that we practice in conservation. With everybody's focus being on the tropics, and deservedly so for a lot of good reasons, we have to remember that there are some side effects to that approach that can have a really negative impact on wildlife that's uniquely adapted to dry environments. The largest mammal to have gone extinct in the last 30 years actually comes from the Sahara. It's the scimitar-horned oryx. It's a very large antelope species that weighs, the males can weigh upwards of 300 pounds. And it's a species that, until not too long ago, used to roam the Sahara in the thousands. But about 30 years ago, the last of them disappeared. And more disturbingly, it disappeared without so much as a whimper or a whisper of outcry by anybody in the world. And this is the kind of thing that we're very concerned about when we look at what's happening to the wildlife in the Sahara, because this is happening on a grand scale across the Sahara for almost all of its wildlife. So people tend to think of the Sahara as this barren wasteland, with just blowing sand and lots of it. And it's certainly true that it's an area that's beautifully sculpted with sand, but there's a great amount of diversity elsewhere. One of the nice things about the sand in the Sahara is there's a story being written every day in front of you, because if you go to bed at night in the Sahara, when you wake up in the morning, you find all kinds of tracks everywhere. So many of the animals in the Sahara are nocturnal. They obviously have a lot of God-given common sense. They stay out of the sun. And at night, jerboas, gerbils, lizards, beetles, snakes of all kinds, and some of the antelope species, many of the carnivores, you'll wake up in the morning and you'll find their tracks everywhere. And you'll find stories written in the sand where here's a jerboa hopping along, a small mammal, and then along behind it comes a fennec fox, and then all of a sudden the jerboa tracks disappear. So things like that. And it's a really unique place and a great opportunity every morning to wake up and find out what's been going on the night before. But as I said, it's not just sand. Certainly there are these grand rolling sculpted dunes that you find that are so evocative of the Sahara, but there's also steppes like you see up here in the upper right-hand corner. There's even grasslands, the Sahelian grasslands in the Sahelo-Saharan zone where this wildlife is found. Short, dry grasslands that come right up against the edge of the Sahara. And in some places there's even acacia woodlands, like you see in the lower right-hand corner there. Mountains, of course, are found in this area too, and there's tremendous diversity in those mountains. Some of the really sculpted forms that you find in Algeria, for example, sculpted by both wind and water over the years. Also, because of the mountains, there's an opportunity for water to collect in places, whether it's ephemeral streams like this one down here in the lower left-hand corner, caused by runoff from the mountains during a rainstorm, a very rare occurrence, or water that actually gets impounded in these shallow depressions called deltas in the mountains, where through thousands of years or millions of years of erosion actually, small granite-like pools have formed that catch the water and create permanent water sources in the middle of the Sahara. Some of these surprisingly have fish, crocodiles, small amphibians. So when we think of the Sahara, there still is some aquatic life to be found in the Sahara as well. The rainfall is incredibly variable and very unpredictable. As I said, there might be some areas of the Sahara that don't see rain for 4 to 7 years after the last rainfall. So it's something that really drives how much biodiversity there can be in the desert. But Edward Abbey, who wrote Desert Solitaire, he's a naturalist from here in the United States, he always reminds us that water is found in a perfect ratio. There is no shortage of water in the desert, but exactly the right amount. A perfect ratio of water to rock, of water to sand, ensuring that wide, free, open, generous spacing among the plants and animals. The desert would not look as cool as it does if it had more water falling on it. And even though it doesn't have the same sort of level of biodiversity as, say, the tropical rainforest, it does have its own unique set of fauna and flora, some of which are exquisitely adapted to life in an extremely arid environment like the Sahara. Animals like the scimitar-horned oryx, which you see in the upper left-hand corner, which, as I said, went extinct in the wild in about 30 years ago. Fortunately, there is a very large population of scimitar-horned oryx in captive collections today, and so there is the opportunity to take one more shot at putting this animal back in the wild. I'm looking out in the audience and I see my friend Ed Spivak sitting over there. Wave your hand, Ed. Ed was for many years the scimitar-horned oryx SSP coordinator, and I'll be talking a little bit later about a project that he and I worked on to actually try to help bring the scimitar-horned oryx back to the Sahara. The addax is walking right in the footsteps of the scimitar-horned oryx. There's probably less than 300 of them in the wild now. It's the other large antelope of the desert and a species that you'll find right here at the zoo. Barbary sheep, probably the only sheep known that can actually exist for long periods of time without water. They live in the mountain areas of the Sahara. The Sahara and the Sahelo-Saharan region has its own species, not species, or subspecies of giraffe, the West African giraffe. Last population, really the only relic population of it left, is in Niger. Then, of course, dama gazelles, slender-horned gazelles, Cuvier's gazelles, Dorcas gazelles. So there is a rich fauna, particularly of the antelope species that live in the desert. There's also a really incredibly diverse population of carnivores that live there. And it's an area that where very few places on the planet where you'll find this many wild dog or canid species all living in the same area, sharing the same resource with overlapping territories. And there's a lot to be discovered there yet, because no one quite understands the relationship between these animals, how they manage to live sympatrically like this. Animals like the pale fox and Ruppel's fox, fennec foxes, golden jackals. There's a number of small cats there as well. Sand cats, wild cats. There's even desert cheetah, incredibly rare, but they're still found there. Striped hyenas. So it's an area that's rich in carnivore species as well. Bird life, quite diverse. Hundreds of species have been recorded, both residents and migrants. The Sahara is part of a major flyway for the birds coming back and forth between Africa and Europe and Asia. So a number of species are recorded there migrating, and there's also a large number of species that actually live in the Sahara year-round. Some of them quite large, quite impressive birds. The desert race of the ostrich, which I'll talk more about later, is the largest of the ostrich. It's a very impressive bird that can reach 10 feet in height. And animals like the bustard. This here happens to be a Nubian bustard, I believe. And reptiles and rodents, just a great diversity of wildlife that's found here. Where'd my cursor go? Oh, there he is. The cute little fella. This is a gerbil. He's very busy. He's got someplace to be. Ed, I knew you'd be here. Ed is also our curator of invertebrates. And they have a really diverse group of invertebrates. And I'm not even going to try to tell you what some of these are, although I do know this one down here. At the lower right-hand corner, that's the assassin beetle, isn't it, Ed? Bombardier. Bombardier beetle. Dang it, I got that one wrong. There is, however, a rich diversity of invertebrates as well. And plant species, too, unique plants adapted to the desert, adapted to the very dry conditions there. So there is a great, tremendous amount of variety to be found in the desert, and a tremendous amount of life in a place that at first glance everybody thinks of as just a big sand pit. Well, as I said earlier, water is life in the desert. Water is the rate limiting factor for everything that goes on there. Succulents provide much needed moisture. You see this citrullus melon here is a wild melon that comes up profusely right after the rains. Many of the antelope species and other animals use the melons in the summertime to extract moisture from them. from the other plant material. Many of the animals are adapted to extracting as much moisture as they can from the plant material they make, and they also are able to convert material in their body into water. It's metabolic water, and so they can go year-round without having to take a drink. Annuals are plentiful, but they're extremely ephemeral. If it rains, there's an explosion of growth in the desert in the next 5 to 6 weeks. Somehow the animals find it. We're not sure how. They migrate, they travel around. Perhaps they're hearing the distant roll of thunder and they head off in that direction. But they manage to arrive right as the grasses are blooming and the flowers are blooming and the grasses are sprouting. So it's something that they take full advantage of. But they're here and then they're gone. Perennials are the key to the dry season resources. Things like this cornulaca bush on the right, which is what addax survive on for most of the year. And there are local migrations, as I said, related to pasture distribution and quality. These animals have to roam over, particularly the herbivores like the addax and the Dorcas gazelles and things like that. They have to roam over huge areas just to find food to survive on. And so as you can imagine, in an area that's covered by 14 countries and 3 million square miles, that sounds like a lot of space, but there's very discrete patches throughout all that space of food at any given time. And the animals are constantly moving around. And when you're trying to come up with a strategy to conserve that kind of wildlife, it becomes a little bit of a logistical nightmare when you realize they're crossing so many geopolitical borders in 1 year, and they're crossing such huge, vast areas. It's not as simple as throwing a fence up and creating a reserve, because the land that you fence in might not receive rain for the next 10 years. Shade is also important. These animals are well adapted to living in the Sahara, but they do that not only physiologically but behaviorally by seeking shade wherever they can. And so it's incredibly important that we identify where the shading areas are, for example, for animals like the addax, so that during the hottest parts of the summer, we know this is an important area for the protection of the addax. There was lots of evidence of a much wetter time in the Sahara. There are these petroglyphs that you'll find in various locations across the Sahara that sort of tell the story of animals that lived in the area when it was a much wetter area. Animals like the elephant on the left and the giraffe on the right. And people have lived across the Sahara for literally thousands of years, various cultures moving back and forth. There's also a great deal of commerce that takes place across the Sahara through the caravans that go through there. Lots of pictographs or petroglyphs of people herding their animals, people hunting, people gathering in the area just for survival. And lots of evidence of ancient cultures too. If you see in the lower right-hand corner, this is a quern or a grinding bowl. It's essentially a stone that's been ground out hollow on one side by another stone to use to grind grain and things like that. And you can literally come across these wherever you go in the Sahara. We've seen them many times. It's just little pieces of antiquity laying out there. You can come into certain areas where there's ancient lake beds, and up in a ring around the ancient lake bed, you'll see this dark ring in the dunes above it. And if you go up there and sift through it, in no time at all you're finding pieces of pottery, you're finding stone arrowheads, stone spearheads, throwing stones, things like that, all hinting at the generation after generation after generation of people thousands of years ago who came and lived around that lake and made use of the resources around there and left their evidence behind. And there's some people who've looked at some of these and drawn their own conclusions about where we all came from and whether we've had visitors from other planets and that sort of thing. I don't profess to that so much, but it's a point of interest that so much has been made of some of the petroglyphs and what they actually represent, and it's kind of comical when you see some of them in person. It was a place at one time that was very rich in the wildlife that it had. Gustav Nachtigall was a German explorer who crossed the Sahara, and he would make these nice little drawings and have these quotes about what the wildlife was like at the time that he crossed. The addax were to be seen grazing peacefully wherever the eye turned. They had so seldom been pursued by man that they did not permit even the closest approach of humans to disturb their ordinary activities. It's quite different today, I can assure you. If you are lucky enough to see an addax, it's usually its white rump running away from you as fast as possible. So heavy has been the persecution over the years. Or the scimitar-horned oryx. Nachtigall's observation was our greyhounds were unloosed, and soon 3 of the innocent animals, a female, a male, and a calf, were killed. They used to be quite plentiful. And so the decline has been all that more astounding, given that some of this took place in the last 50 to 75 years. A century later, the story is, as I said, quite different. What you're looking at here is the last known photo of scimitar-horned oryx in the wild. It was shot by John Newby of the Sahara Conservation Fund. This was taken in 1980. The species itself is believed to have gone extinct by the 1990s, probably the early 1990s. And it begs the question, what's next to go? The addax, the dama gazelles. Saharan populations of other species are also highly threatened. The cheetah, the striped hyena, the desert race of the ostrich. This video, I'm going to warn you ahead of time, is a little bit graphic. It involves one of the primary reasons these animals are going extinct. And so if you're squeamish at all, you might not want to watch the video. It involves a hunt. One of the problems that's been taking place in the Sahara really since World War II is the introduction of automatic weapons and all-terrain vehicles that allow people now to go out and pursue animals in a way that they never could before, and in a fashion that's completely unsustainable. This is a hunt that took place in the Sudan. This happens to be a hunting party from one of the Arab states, a wealthy hunting party from one of the Arab states that went in and did some hunting in the Sudan over a several-week period. That is not in any way, shape, or form to suggest that it is only wealthy hunters from the Arab states. Hunting has long been a problem. Unsustainable hunting has long been a problem in the Sahara. The Sahara Conservation Fund has absolutely nothing against hunting, and hunting is something that, in fact, in many countries has proven to be quite a boon to conservation with the trophy fees and the licensing fees and all that it generates. But what's going on today in a fashion that is unregulated, not based on any kind of scientific quotas, really wildlife being sold off to the highest bidder, is completely unsustainable. And it's one of the primary reasons today that so many of the antelope species in particular are going extinct in the Sahara. This is not, again, a problem of just wealthy hunters coming in from other countries. As I said, World War II brought automatic weapons and all-terrain vehicles into the Sahara and made it very simple for just a handful of people at any given time to go out into a very broad area and literally slaughter wildlife and wipe it off the planet. Again, this is a little bit graphic, but it'll give you some sense of just how much is taken in one of these hunts. These are all Dorcas gazelle carcasses here. They've got just as many more in the bag and loaded on the truck. We've heard of hunts where they took as many as 800 Dorcas gazelles and 12 to 15 addax in a hunt. A 12 to 15 addax doesn't sound like much. When there's only 300 addax left in the wild, that's a huge percentage of the wild population. So it's this kind of thing that's neither sustainable, it's not legal, it's not ethical, and it's the kind of thing that many of these nations need to come to grips with if they're going to have any wildlife left. Warfare and modern arms certainly are what set off the influx of these weapons and these all-terrain vehicles, but human beings being what they are, if you're having trouble making a living and someone makes it easy for you to live off the land, we'll always find a way to take that to the extreme, won't we? As a result, so many of the species that you find in the Sahara now are listed on the IUCN Red Data list, and a number of the ones that aren't listed as critically endangered yet in the Sahara, it's simply because there are other forms of them found elsewhere. So you'll see the ostrich listed as least concern, yet 95% of the desert race of the ostrich have been exterminated in the last 30 years. So that's pretty bleak, I know, but what can we do about it? Well, a number of zoos and wildlife biologists got together several years ago and decided that there needed to be some kind of coordinated group that would get together and begin talking about strategies for conservation in the Sahara and looking for ways to raise awareness about conservation in the Sahara. And so out of that, the Sahara Conservation Fund was born. SCF was established to address the extinction crisis facing the wildlife of the Sahara and the bordering Sahelian grasslands. And our mission is to conserve wildlife in key habitats in partnership with stakeholders from all sectors of society. Sahara Conservation Fund has a interesting background. It was established in 2004. It's been incorporated here in the United States, here in Missouri, as a 501c3 not-for-profit with tremendous support from the St. Louis Zoo. In fact, our financial base at the moment in the U.S. is here at the St. Louis Zoo. There is a small operational base in Switzerland because that's where our CEO, John Newby, lives. He lives in Switzerland because so much of the money that comes for supportive projects comes from places like the EU, from France's environmental fund called FFEM, and it also places John Newby within a 4 or 5 hour plane ride of Africa to go visit the projects whenever he needs to. We have representation in Niger, in Africa as well, where some of our larger projects are, and memoranda of understanding with partners in the Alain Zoo, Germany's organization NABU, Exotic Wildlife Association, Conventional Migratory Species, looking for anybody and everybody that's willing to partner on conservation in the Sahara. We sort of have 3 strands for the program of conservation that SCF tries to follow. Saving Sahara's wildlife population and their key habitats, captive breeding and the reintroduction of lost species, and communicating the value of deserts and the need for their conservation. Sahara Conservation Fund believes very strongly that the best bang for your buck is going to be conserve the wildlife that's there still in the wild right now. But it also recognizes that some of that wildlife is gone now. Scimitar-horned oryx, for example. There will be no scimitar-horned oryx in the wild ever again unless you take advantage of captive breeding and the reintroduction of lost species like the scimitar-horned oryx and to some extent animals like the addax as well, which have been exterminated across a huge portion of their range and now only are found in a small part of Niger in Western Africa. And then, of course, the other thing is doing everything we can to raise awareness about the plight of the wildlife in the Sahara and the things that can and should be done to try to reverse that trend, that silent crisis of extinction. So the solutions that we look for are things that involve action both in the countries of origin and also ex situ, places like here at the St. Louis Zoo and zoos across North America and Europe that are making contributions to the captive breeding pool for reintroduction where needed. Control of hunting, getting the word out there and bringing a lot of attention to the fact that this unsustainable hunting is going on in some of the last refuges for this wildlife. Improved land and natural resource use, reintroduction projects where it's appropriate to do so, where there aren't any animals left in the wild to actually protect, and promotion of arid lands and working with the local stakeholders. This is just to give you some idea of some of the sites where SCF is working. We're not all over the Sahara. We're a very small organization still finding our way, but we do have some projects in key areas that I'll be talking about momentarily. We've been involved in some antelope reintroductions in Tunisia for both scimitar-horned oryx and addax out of zoo-born animals. We're in the process of working on some wildlife surveys in Algeria. We've done a fencing project to follow up on some reintroduction of scimitar-horned oryx reintroduction that was done in Senegal, and that will be followed shortly by some additional animals being sent over that will bolster the genetics of that population of animals in a fenced reserve. We are working with ostrich, with the recovery of the desert race of the ostrich in Niger, where we are actually using captive breeding on the ground among private ostrich holders in Niger itself to try to create enough impetus, enough production of birds in order to be able to have some to reintroduce back to the wild, into reserves. And we're doing a lot of work in the Termit-Tintuma region of Niger, where the last population of addax, the last significant population of addax is found. There's probably 300 addax left in the wild, and of that 300 addax, about 220 of them are found in the Termit-Tintuma region of Niger. So if you can imagine, the addax used to roam pretty much across most of the Sahara, the deepest parts of the desert, and now they're limited to a small area in central Niger. Lastly, of course, we are doing, we just recently launched a study on carnivores in the area that we'll talk about too. There is tremendous cultural diversity in the Sahara. There are a number of different tribes that are both nomadic and others that are sedentary, and all of these people have a say in what's going on with their wildlife. And surprisingly, many of them are extremely interested in seeing the wildlife return, extremely interested in finding solutions that allow them to coexist with the wildlife. It just is going to take a lot of work and a lot of compromise with people to try and work out strategies that allow everybody to have what they want to get out of life in the desert. Working with local people is going to be absolutely key to the success in the area. Well, what are some of the projects we're doing, or how have some of those projects been going? In the Termit-Tintuma region of Niger, again, the last viable population of addax on the planet is there. This says plus or minus 300. There's probably, we have a better idea now that's closer to 220 addax in Termit-Tintuma region. And again, that's out of what we believe to be 300 total addax across the Sahara. Dama gazelles, cheetahs, Barbary sheep are still found here. There's an extraordinary diversity of small carnivores in this area in particular. It actually is one of the last lifeboats for a huge part of the Sahelo-Saharan wildlife. And it's one of the places where, if you want to go see Sahelo-Saharan wildlife, it's one of the few places you can go and be guaranteed that you'll still have a chance at seeing some of these animals. The effort is underway now. We've been working for a number of years with the Republic of Niger to try and establish a protected area of 38,000 square miles in the Termit-Tintuma region. And it's really based on a science-based approach with popular support from the local people. It's taken a tremendous amount of time and a tremendous amount of support from a lot of different people in order to make this happen. And I want to really, in particular, recognize a number of the zoos that the St. Louis Zoo has been working with and Sahara Conservation Fund has been working with to help get it together and make this program a possibility in Niger. What kinds of things are going on? We've conducted a number of aerial surveys in the Termit-Tintuma region. And you can see these are some of the photos that have been produced of the addax taken from the airplane. We fly these transects. If you look up here in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see these nice, even, parallel, light blue lines tracing across there. And the plane flies those transects in straight lines out about 140 kilometers and turns back about, I believe the transects are now about 14.5 kilometers apart, and just continues to zigzag back and forth and count animals. Using a methodology that allows us then to get a really good population estimate of where these animals are sighted. We also do ground truth surveys where we take the vehicles out and run the same kinds of transects where we'll drive out and not only record the wildlife that we see, but also take periodic readings on vegetation and things like that, so that we begin to develop a resource map, if you will. What's out there? Where are the animals being found, and what are the resources that are found in that area? It begins to paint a picture for us of exactly what's important to these animals when you start talking about creating a reserve and a protected area for addax. You need to know what's important to them. It's not just, you know, where's the food, it's not just where's the water. In some cases, it's where's the shade structure, where's the route that's furthest from the caravan lines, where there's a lot of disturbance that takes place when the big caravans come through the desert. So it really begins to paint a picture for us then when you overlay the animal sightings with the other resources that you map out as to what's really going to become important in terms of preserving that area. And one of the tools that we've been using most recently are the camera traps. First, you got to find your tree. You have to attach your camera trap to something. But the camera traps allow us to make observations when we're not there. And the technology has improved dramatically on these camera traps. They're now digital. They can shoot, they have huge memory cards on them, so they can shoot thousands of pictures in one sitting. You can set them up on a sort of a timer basis so that they'll shoot a picture and they won't be triggered again for 5 seconds after that. So if something just passes in front of me, you get one picture of it. If it hangs out in the area, it'll continue to trigger pictures, which has led to some interesting evenings. We once got 4,000 photos of the same donkey one night, but that doesn't happen very often, but it certainly is disturbing when you go through 4,000 photos and find nothing but a donkey. Well, what kind of data does this allow us to collect? This is a little photo sequence that just shows what we had tried to do was set up. That's a Dorcas gazelle that went by. Here comes a male addax. And again, it's shooting a picture about every 5 seconds or so, or a couple seconds. So if the addax is walking around in front of it, it's going to shoot multiple pictures of the addax, and those can even be strung together to give you some idea of his behavior. One of the reasons that we started setting these out was nobody had any idea where the addax were going during the heat of this, during the real hot parts of the year. They would just vanish from the Tintuma. And so we suspected, based on the dung we were seeing and common sense, that they were trying to find shade, but which areas of shading were most important to those addax. And so we started looking for trees that showed signs of addax hanging out there in the past. And when the hot season came on, our camera traps were set up, and we were able to start capturing images of the addax coming in and using those areas. And that begins to paint a picture for us again of this area here is incredibly important to the addax. It's an area that, that they use a lot, that they use it traditionally year after year, and it also gives us a chance, quite frankly, to see changes in the vegetation over time. If we leave the camera trap up for a year and it's shooting pictures, when it shoots pictures of animals, it also captures pictures of the vegetation around them, the conditions. This area you're looking at right now in this picture, at different times of the year, could be covered with a really nice coating of green grass if the rains hit it just right. So it really is that big of a change that takes place. We also get some idea of behavior from these little vignettes that occur. This is a juvenile female trying to come in and get under the tree with some adult females. She's being very circumspect about it because she doesn't have a very high rank. If you watch this female closest to her turn her horns into her and remind her, you are, in fact, subordinate to me. In fact, you better move. I'm going to horn you again. It also allows us to do individual identification of animals. Here's one that actually has one horn. Again, you can tell by her posture and by her behavior that she is submissive to these other females. So she's very careful about how she decides to lay down here. Sometimes I think she knows we're watching. These shade areas are so incredibly important to the addax, and what you'll find when you come up on them is that they'll dig these pits in the sand to get down to the cooler sand, also to get to the roots of the trees that they're shading underneath for moisture. You see, she's adapted the very clever strategy of I will give you the smallest surface area possible to take a shot at, my rear end. And this is a submissive posture that, that she's adopting here with her head down. It's very similar to what the calves do when the calves are first born. They're hiders, and they'll lay flat on the ground and just try to pretend like they're not there. That's what's going on in Termit and Tintuma right now in the project to establish a reserve for the addax. Parallel to that, there was a question that came up about the carnivores that live in this area. Any reserve has to have a healthy population of all the wildlife in order to have a balanced ecosystem that includes the carnivores. But we're also aware that there are a number of people that live in and around the edges of this proposed reserve. A lot of nomads who move through there at different times of year with their sheep and their goats, with their camels. And so in order to answer questions for them, we started taking a closer look at the carnivore population here. Not so much because there's a lot of predation on livestock, although there are a few species that will prey on livestock, most notably the golden jackal, occasionally the cheetah, and occasionally the hyena. The downside is there are a lot of these other carnivores living there that are sort of suffering the wrath of the local people whenever there is predation by hyena or cheetah or jackals, because as is common in many places around the world, people sometimes put out strychnine baits to try to take care of the jackal or the hyena or the cheetah that came up and ate their goat. And unfortunately, fennec foxes and Ruppell's foxes and sandcats and African wildcats and a lot of these other smaller carnivores, they'll come up and eat those carcasses too. They're absolutely no threat whatsoever to the livestock at all, but they end up dying as collateral damage in this misguided effort to try to control predators. And so we were asked by the Republic of Niger to take a closer look at the carnivore populations there, to get a better understanding of exactly what these animals are doing, how big is the actual risk to the livestock there, and if necessary, to try and develop some strategies, if you will, some suggestions as to steps they could take to control that predation without actually going so far as killing all the carnivores that come within 100 miles of a goat. And so it began in mid-2009 of this year in cooperation with Oxford University's Wild Crew. Crew stands for, that's Carnivore, isn't it? No, it's CANID, CANID Research Unit. Right, Ed, isn't that what it is? Yeah. The objective was, of course, as I said, to study the carnivore ecology, but with particular emphasis on livestock predation and coming up with a management plan that gives people who live in the area some assurance that their needs, their interests in maintaining livestock will be included in the management plan for the park. It did receive funding from AZA's Conservation Endowment Fund, from the St. Louis Zoo, Oregon Zoo, White Oak, and several private donors. And we were very recently fortunate to have these zoos that you see on the bottom also provide money for a vehicle for the scientist that's over there now. What he's doing is setting camera traps in a grid system around the area, trying to get a handle on what species are present. And he's also, in some cases, setting box traps to capture animals and put radio collars on them. We have several Ruppell's foxes now that are being tracked with radio collars, a couple of pale foxes, and I believe one fennec fox now as well. And again, we're getting an opportunity to see some things that very few people have seen before. I'm going to show you what, oddly enough, is probably the first video that we're aware of pale foxes. It's a species that's found in the Sahel on the edge of the Sahara and wanders out to the edge of the Sahara as well. And when we first came across these back in 2002 and started shooting pictures of them, we immediately had people calling us and asking us to give them our pictures because there's no good pictures of these things. Well, now we have a video of them as well. This is a colony that lives here. I'm not going to play this whole video because it goes on for like 3 minutes, but you get the idea. They're cute little foxes and absolutely no harm to anybody, but as you can imagine, if they find a piece of bait that's been laced with strychnine, they're going to chow down on it like any carnivore would. And apparently they need some flea control too, based on what we're seeing there. I will, however, show you something very interesting that we came across that had not been reported before, and I'm not sure how clearly that's playing up on the screen up there, but this is, to our knowledge, the first colonial situation where a cat and a canid are actually sharing the same colony. There's an African wildcat here in the foreground, another one there to the left in the background, and they're right in the middle, living in the middle of a pale fox colony. You'll see in a minute the camera will pan to the right, and there's even more pale foxes over here, and they seem to be going in and out of each other's holes, and nobody seems to have a real clear picture as to who lives where here, but they seem to be living in relative peace. You don't find them lying right next to each other or anything like that, but every time that the team goes by here, they find the cats and the foxes together. So it's going to be really interesting teasing out what the relationship is between these guys and how they partition the resources. Ostrich project in Niger. I think this is probably one of the most, the biggest opportunities we have in order to make an almost immediate impact in the wildlife in Niger. The ostrich was exterminated largely because of the civil war that took place in the late 80s, early 90s in Niger. They had been hunted down to a relatively small level to begin with. There were probably 1,500 to 2,000 birds left, and then the war broke out, and the majority of those birds were found up in the northern part of Niger, which is where the rebels were living, and someone at some point got the bright idea that the rebels are living on ostriches, so let's wipe out the ostrich and the rebels will have nothing to live on. Well, they were very effective at wiping out the ostrich. The rebels, not so much. However, as a result, there are now no ostrich left in the wild in Niger, and as I said earlier, the desert race of the red-necked ostrich has been exterminated across 95% of its range. That being said, there are a number of people, private individuals in Niger, who, when the ostrich was going extinct, took it upon themselves for various reasons, some of them altruistic, some of them they thought they'd make a profit, whatever their reasons were. Thank God they did it, because they captured some chicks. And so there are about 100 of these birds scattered across numerous areas in private hands in Niger. And Sahara Conservation Fund saw an opportunity to try to work with these local people, to try to get some of them involved in a consortium, if you will, that would actually breed these birds in captivity and try to produce chicks. Now, as you all know, ostrich can be ranched. It's done all the time in South Africa. It's done all the time here in Texas. So it's something that has tremendous potential. What you may not know is that it's not the easiest chicken to raise on your farm the first time out. There are some challenges to it. But those challenges are all can be overcome with practice and with the right technical inputs and that sort of thing. So the focus of the work is on working with these local ostrich owners. We've provided them with technical advice. We've provided them with feeding advice and some feed to help improve the ration for the birds. Tried to improve the infrastructure that the birds are being kept in. We've even provided them with an incubator last year so they could try their hand at incubating some of the eggs artificially, which allows the birds then to lay even more eggs. If you let them set one set of eggs, they'll set on those eggs and do it. If you pull some of those eggs, they'll continue to lay more and more eggs, and so you can get more ostrich out of them if you can artificially incubate some. We've done a tremendous amount of work on genetic analysis of these captive birds to make sure that we were in fact working with birds that are purebred desert race of the red-necked ostrich. Very pleased to say that we were able to identify for the 49 birds we sampled, all 49 were of the purebred redneck race. And the goal is to try to get reproduction going to the point where within the next 3 to 5 years we can actually have chicks to release in the wild. There are significant health and husbandry challenges to be met. As I said, rearing ostrich is not the easiest thing to cut your teeth on the first time out, but it is something that that is really going to be critical in order to get to see these birds return to Niger. Here's our incubator, and the gentleman on the right is candling the egg to determine if it's fertile or not, using a flashlight to light up the egg, and then the blood spot and later the structures of the embryo begin to appear as shadows that he can see through the egg, through the lighted egg. It's one of our chicks hatching in a bowl, and these are a couple of our chicks that were produced this year. So we've made some progress. We still haven't reached the point where we're actually producing chicks that we can use for reintroduction, but as a first try, especially for training a group of people who'd never really raised an ostrich in their lives, they made some great strides, and we're really hopeful that the coming breeding season that there'll be some improvements that we can make, both in terms of the diets and the infrastructure and technique, that will lead to sustainable growth of the population. Our Pan-Saharan wildlife surveys is another project that we're working on, and this is really trying to get a handle on what's left out there across the Sahara. It's a big undertaking because, as I said, it's a 3 million square mile area, and you need to be strategic about where you're going to look, because you're not going to be able to look in every nook and cranny of that 3 million square miles. But there are key areas that we know very little about in terms of what wildlife is left. These wildlife surveys were spearheaded, or spearhead for conservation action. They were actually, I'm quite pleased to report, funded by the private department of Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed of Abu Dhabi. You will hear sometimes people talk about some of these wealthy hunting parties coming from the Gulf and some of the damage they've done to the wildlife. The flip side to that is there's tremendous interest in wildlife in many of these Gulf states. Many of these wealthy sheikhs actually have huge collections of these animals of their own back home in UAE, in Saudi Arabia, and places like that. And Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in particular, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, has been a real champion for wildlife conservation in the Sahara. He recently awarded €527,000 grant to SCF for these Pan-Saharan wildlife surveys. They're going to be taking place now over the next 2 years. And so we really can't emphasize enough that as much as some areas of the world might have contributed to a problem, there's also every reason to believe that with the right attitudinal change, with the right information, you can get people on board to be real champions for the wildlife as well. Wildlife conservation in Senegal, and this is winding down really quickly, but over in Senegal, there was a reintroduction done many years ago of scimitar-horned oryx, a small reintroduction in a park in the Furlough. This park needed a tremendous amount of work in terms of infrastructure upgrade, new fencing, all that sort of thing, some technical training as well. And so SCF was asked to come over and provide some additional resources. We focused on building the fence at Katani, a breeding enclosure for more scimitar-horned oryx. Game fencing and the tools were provided by the Exotic Wildlife Association. So in this case, it wasn't the zoos, it was the private breeders in Texas and Oklahoma and places like that that actually stepped forward and said, you know, we'd like to make a contribution here to conservation. And the next steps will be to include a new import of animals to Senegal, scimitar and oryx, to help reestablish and rejuvenate the population that's there behind fence in the reserve there. And also to do some survey work in the Furlough, focused on other species as well that are still there. There is still a population of the desert ostrich there, as well as red-fronted gazelles. So that will fall under the Pan-Saharan Wildlife Survey. Addax and oryx reintroduction, I mentioned earlier that Ed Spivak over there and I had the pleasure of working on this in our roles as species coordinators for addax and for scimitar-horned oryx here at the St. Louis Zoo. It's a natural partnership for zoos to do something like this because obviously we have the technical expertise to breed animals in captivity. Many of these species that we are breeding are extinct or near extinct, like the oryx and the addax, which the addax have been extinct, locally extinct in Tunisia for about 75 years. And zoos in the US and Europe have strong breeding programs for the species. So there's every reason to believe that there's a role that we can play in trying to help turn the tide where some of these extinctions have occurred. Descendants from animals from the first reintroduction that took place in Buhedma National Park in Tunisia in 1985 were first relocated to Jabil for the addax and to Drumus National Park in January of 2007. There were, from a reintroduction that was done in Buhedma back in 1985, about 120 scimitar-horned oryx and about 70 addax. They had done quite well with them there, but they did need additional genetic stock from the zoos in order to bolster the genetic diversity of that group, and additional technical advice about moving the animals and establishing new populations at other reserves that they wanted to build in Tunisia. This required that we get together with our friends in Europe who have similar breeding programs, coordinate so that we better understand the relationship between our animals and theirs, and we can send the most genetically diverse population back for reintroduction and identify animals from both European and American zoos, including this handsome addax up here on the right that was born at the St. Louis Zoo, who eventually went back. There were 8 addax and 7 scimitar-horned oryx that left the U.S. In December 5th, 2007 for Luxembourg. In Luxembourg, they were joined by 5 addax and 2 oryx from the European zoo community for a flight to Tozeur, Tunisia. Zoo staff from AZA and IAZA participants accompanied the animals throughout the journey. I was fortunate enough to get to go with the addax from St. Louis. That's a picture of our team. Air transport was interesting. We flew over on a very large and luxurious cargo flight from here to Europe, but then the flight to Tunisia was somewhat decidedly less luxurious. It was an old Antonov 74, I believe, Russian military cargo plane that had some suspicious holes in the cargo hold. A lot of sunlight came through, so that was nice. Upon arriving, we were told that the cargo bay was not pressurized, but not to worry, we don't fly over 10,000 feet anyway. So it was interesting flying. You got to see a lot of the ground because we got to fly close. Just an example of one of the crates in the back of the plane. And the vet that we brought with us was able to check the animals at each location. Once we landed in Tozeur, with the addax at least, it was still another grueling 8 or 9 hours of driving, a lot of it through sand in these big heavy trucks with the crates loaded on board to get them out to the site where the release would take place in a fenced reserve called Jabil National Park. We got in very late at night, so we waited till morning to unload. Luckily, we had a boom truck with us so we could lift the crates off. And then at some point, you line them all up and you're ready to go. And the animals are released into acclimation pens, where they had a chance to get reacquainted with each other and for people to meet their new neighbors. The addax who had been brought down from Buhedma National Park came right up to the acclimation pens to say howdy do. It's important to put them in the acclimation pens when they first arrive, just to make sure that in the first month or so after their arrival that they didn't have some injury in transport or can come down with some illness or other stressor from the long transport, because they were in crates for at least 80 hours on the flight and the travel over there. But I can only imagine it was a bit of culture shock for them when they left their nice little zoos and found themselves out here in the heart of the Sahara in the Tunisia. Similar process was followed with the scimitar-horned oryx in Drumus National Park, unloading of the crates, release of the animals into the acclimation pens, getting reacquainted with each other, and ultimately being released out into the larger fenced reserve with the other animals that had been translocated from Buhedma National Park. There were 44 zoos working on this project. Why does that always convert itself to black ink? I don't know. Anyway, I put this up only to point out that when you get to the point where you have to do reintroduction, things are really, really bad. And it's probably the most expensive conservation project you can be involved in, which is why the St. Louis Zoo, in conjunction with Sahara Conservation Fund, our goal is always to look for the place first and foremost where we can conserve the animals that are left, like Termit tintuma, where there's still a decent population of addax. In some cases, that's not going to be possible, and then you do have to go to that really expensive step of trying to reintroduce animals back to the wild, like the scimitar-horned oryx, and like addax in places like Tunisia, where they've been exterminated, and it's going to take reintroduction to bring them back. Thought you'd get a kick out of this. This is the actual release, and they're off and running. And you release them all at the same time so they'll stick together, but these three didn't know. So they decided they would strike off boldly on their own. It was tremendously gratifying traveling with these animals and not getting a lick of sleep for 80 hours and all of that, to open the crate and have every last one of them run out and have all of them out there and thriving and doing well now, and knowing they're in the reserve. The oryx, we just had somebody come back who went over to check on the oryx for us, and all 32 of the oryx, both the ones that were brought over from zoos and the ones that were mixed with them from Buhedma, every last one of the 32 females has had a calf now, and the addax have started reproducing as well. The addax have not been as productive as the oryx, but part of that is because there's more jackals in the park where the addax are, and so these animals are learning all over again how to cope with predators in the area for their calves. So hopefully that's going to right itself, and the experience that they gain with each calving season will bring them to a much more productive state. Wildlife conservation in Algeria. We have a number of wildlife surveys that are ongoing in this area. Future projects are going to be defined through our partnership with the Wildlife Department and the universities in Algeria. There's a plan underway right now that is probably going to be funded by Sonatrach Foundation, which is a nationalized oil company in Algeria that wants to come up with a conservation strategy. What's interesting about Algeria compared to other countries is they actually have pretty good resources. They've got good oil wealth there, and they have a mandate in the areas where they extract the oil to actually do something positive for both the local people and the wildlife there. And so there's money that is now becoming available for these kinds of wildlife studies and for this kind of work, in order to try to ensure a future where this wildlife can still be out there in the Sahara. Well, that's pretty much all I had to talk about in terms of the projects. I do want to point out that we have lots of resources that are available to you if you want to learn more about the Sahara. We have a newsletter that we put out quarterly called Sanskrit, and it can be found on our website. We have a pretty extensive website now at www.saharaconservation.org. And not to be outdone by the kids of today, we even have our own Facebook site. Facebook is relatively new to me, but we've got a tremendous amount of interest actually that's come to us, including people who are now going to the Facebook site and actually donating money for the cause. So that's been really gratifying to see. And I thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I think what I'll do is, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I'm going to go ahead and, there's a couple of film clips that I really they don't require any narration, but I'll just let them run in the background. So if you're interested in seeing them, you can watch those as well. Are there any questions? I just messed that up. Oh, there it goes. Yes? The immunology of the animals, what's the death rate? Well, to date, we haven't seen any deaths, so that's good. And we have to go through tremendous testing of the animals before we can take them over there. There was a list of tests a mile long, and there should be, that the Tunisian government wanted run before the animals were brought back. And so Fortunately, the other thing about it is, in case of the zoo-bred animals, they get tremendous veterinary care, and we know an awful lot about their medical histories compared to other animals out there. And so we are able to say with some confidence that these animals are, to the best of our knowledge, disease-free. And there were some animals that didn't pass their tests, so they didn't get to go. Whenever you do these kinds of projects, you know, there's tremendous amount of permitting involved as well. And in order for us to get the permits for the animals, we had to prove that we had met all the requirements for this testing. And we also had to name far more animals than we were actually planning to send, because there is always the possibility that if you need 10 animals and you only name 10 animals, 2 or 3 of them might not pass their testing. So God bless the San Diego Zoo. I have to put a plug in for them, because they took all the animals we named, and it was a large number of animals, housed them at their place. It took much longer to get the permits than we expected. It took 13 months versus the couple of months we thought it was going to take. And they ended up holding the rest of the animals that didn't go for us for quite a period of time after that. So it really was a tremendous investment on their part. Yes? One of the things that we know that's occurred is that a lot of the hunting that takes place is very much under the table. It'll be for a variety of reasons. Let's talk about Niger, for example. Niger is the poorest place on the planet by any standard. If you look at United Nations economic indicators, they consistently score at the bottom of every indicator there possibly is. As you can imagine, in a place like that, why aren't you going? In a place like that, the, get out of the way. When someone flashes money, it's going to get attention. And so someone coming in from the outside who's wealthy offers money to a minister, sometimes for a very good cause, like we'll build you an airstrip, we'll rebuild these schools for you, we'll build a hospital in the area. That kind of money talks big to them because they don't have it. And so, and then sometimes it's just greed. Sometimes the minister, you know, they get to the right minister and he wants to take a bribe to do this. How do we know that we've had an impact? One of the biggest impacts that we know of is that there was a plan for Gaddafi's son to come over from Libya to do a hunt right in the heart of the Termit-Tintuma Reserve. And we were, through the work that we had done with the local people, we were able to catch wind of that because, you know, a celebrity like that coming over is going to draw notice. The local people alerted SCF. SCF then in turn was able to alert IUCN, the Convention on Migratory Species, the president of Niger, to put him on notice. Not in a threatening way, but just to sort of say, you invited us here, you took money from the Convention on Migratory Species, help us understand how that is compatible with allowing this person to come in and do this hunt. And as a result of that kind of pressure, the hunt was canceled. And we're aware of that happening in a couple of places on a couple of different occasions. So we're very pleased with that. And we're very pleased too that we are now seeing, before we say anything, we're seeing a lot of the local people get up in arms and raise a big stink in the local papers, in the capital city in Niamey, to let people know, wait a minute, this is our wildlife, what are you doing? You know, if you sell our heritage off now, it's not going to be there, you know, for our kids. So, other questions? Those are the scimitar-horned oryx at the fenced reserve in Senegal that we help provide additional support for. That's an African wildcat creeping through the grass. Yes?
How much acclimatization is necessary when you reintroduce the animals to the desert?
You know, it's interesting. The animals didn't seem to have too much problem with climate per se. What you do need to make sure of, and fortunately we have lots of a really good model to follow with the Arabian oryx reintroductions that were done in Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, places like that. The key with ungulates, desert ungulate species, is to make sure that you time your reintroduction to a time of year when you can be fairly certain that there's going to be really good resources in the area. So to the extent possible, the rainy season. Now there's more rainfall in Tunisia than there is in Niger, so it's a little bit easier to predict when there's going to be a rainy season in Niger. And the Tunisian authorities, to their credit, had done a tremendous amount of work for about 5 years on these two sites in order to rehabilitate the land so that there was lots of vegetation, lots of cover, that sort of thing there for the animals to exist on. If you get them there at a time when resources are good, they don't seem to have any problem making the shift and figuring out which plant species to select, when to make a shift from one plant species to the next. If you put them over there at a time of crisis, where they, then you create a situation where beggars can't be choosers, and they're liable to eat just about anything, including things that, ultimately might be harmful to them. So a lot of it has to do with the timing and the way in which you go about it. Other questions? Yes. Hey, John. I didn't see you there.
How much of this do you think has to do with global warming and as opposed to hunting and other more sort of approximate?
Well, that's a difficult thing to quantify. What we do know about the sort of massive crisis of extinction for ungulates in the Sahara is that it is really heavily influenced by the hunting pressure that's taken place there. There are large tracts of what you would consider to be pretty darn good habitat out there today with no animals in it. And it's strictly because the animals have been hunted out of it. Now, does global warming have some kind of influence? I think most assuredly it has a real serious influence at the Sahelo-Saharan zone, where the Sahel meets the Sahara, because of the desertification that's taking place there. But what we have to remember is that a lot of that desertification that's taking place at that edge is also man-made from really poor land use practices, from overgrazing, from planting crops in an area that can't really sustain tilling the land, that sort of thing. So it's kind of hard to tease that apart. The other thing that's people often ask me, why should we give a hoot what goes on in the Sahara? I always like to remind them that someone who came to visit us named Katrina came out of the Sahara. It is the birthplace of all the hurricanes and tropical storms that come through our area. The larger that desert gets, the more air that it's able to superheat, the larger the storm systems are going to get. And so there is a real selfish reason for folks here in the United States to care deeply about, maintaining the balance that does exist in the Sahara, because if the desertification increases, we're going to see even worse storms. That probably didn't really give you much of a clear answer, but there you have it. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
Where was the film from that time secured? Was that out something on YouTube or something?
No. If you go to certain marketplaces, you can in the Middle East, you can find them for sale. People have their homemade DVDs of the hunts that they took. Yeah, there were. John Newby picked that one up in UAE, but he told me that there were probably 20 different DVDs to choose from. So, what you need to remember too about the hunting that takes place, a lot of times it's driven by really traditional cultural values. The reason that the Gulf states are so interested in the Sahara is primarily because of falconry. They go there to practice falconry. Falconry is really deeply entrenched in their society. When the Bedouins were wandering, they had their falcon. The falcon was the only animal that ate at the table with the family. The dogs, they stayed outside, but the falcon was brought into the tent at night and stayed with the owner. So they're interested in doing falconry. They're interested in hunting these bustards in particular. That's a sport that's really ingrained. The problem is when they go out, they now have the wealth to go out in such huge caravans that it's completely unsustainable, you know, where they might bring a stable of 30 or 40 birds. And these falcons, some of them are hybrid falcons. They'll cross different species together to get a bigger, stronger, faster bird. Some of them can take gazelles. And they certainly are hunting bustards to extinction. They're hunting the desert hare is hunted by these things. But while they're there, there's all this other wildlife that they see, and there's an entourage to be fed and that sort of thing. And so, sort of as a byproduct of the interest in falconry, a lot of other animals end up getting shot. Now, this is not to say that every single person who does falconry is evil and is responsible for the destruction of wildlife in the Sahara. But it just points out that even a handful of people with tremendous wealth, when one guy can land a 747 in Niger on an airstrip that he paid to have built so that he could take, you know, 16 all-terrain vehicles and a helicopter with heat-detecting radar and all these other things out there just for the sole purpose of basically counting coup. How many animals can I kill in one hunt? That one person, because of their wealth, can have a monstrous influence to the negative on the wildlife. On the flip side, you have people like Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, who has just established a $25 million conservation fund for wildlife conservation, and has in fact been incredibly generous in recent years with Sahara Conservation Fund's work to try to do this survey work and establish you know, what is the extent of the problem in the Sahara. So it isn't an either-or kind of thing. It isn't one side's all bad, one side's all good. It's really about changing attitudes and getting people, the right people, engaged in becoming part of the solution. Other questions? Yes. Yes.
Is there anything being done to stop the hunting?
Well, yes. As I said, we've been very successful in Niger in particular in getting local people engaged and having them start a program or start making noise when they hear the hunts are coming, having them come and tell us when it's taking place, giving us forewarning. And that's, again, how we were able to put a stop to the hunt from Gaddafi's son. And there were a couple of other hunts just like that that we were able to bring a stop to. And now Niger has actually closed the hunting season for the last 3 years in Niger. So there's been a lot of progress made in that regard with Niger, which is the place I'm most familiar with because that's where we do a good deal of our work. But it is something that you need to be constantly vigilant about because there will always be somebody out there who's willing to offer a lot of money to do the thing that they want to do that they're not allowed to do. And in a country as poor as Niger, it won't be hard to find somebody who really, really desperately needs that money and is willing to, you know, look the other way or try to help you do the thing that you're not supposed to do. So that dynamic tension will always be there. And I suppose, you know, the ultimate solution to that problem is, you know, how do we get Niger to the point where they're not so dependent on living hand to mouth every day, everybody in the country.